So this is the key here. The key to life is getting a co-author that has skill. Everybody follow this? It is. I have no skills. Tim Loughran, University of Notre Dame. The person who has skills in textual analysis, natural language processing and textual analysis in finance and accounting is Bill McDonald. I will go over there and Bill will give the talk. And periodically I may make a comment or something like that, but Bill is really the workhorse for all of our papers in textual analysis. I'd like to introduce Bill McDonald.
So, what Tim has politely said is I am Tim Loughran's research assistant. Thank you for attending. You don't have a clicker here, I assume, with the technology you set me up with.
Yeah, what?
Okay. No, that's all right. Tim and I presented, we got into this 5 years ago or so, and the first time we presented a paper at Notre Dame's, I'll try to stand still. The first time we presented a paper at Notre Dame's research seminar, I started with this slide. And after doing the presentation, it dawned on me that there were really two audiences in the group at our Notre Dame research seminar. The junior faculty already knew what textual analysis was, and about half of them were doing it. And the senior faculty, and the junior faculty had no idea where this quote came from. And the senior faculty had no clue as to what textual analysis was, but they all knew where the quote came from. Of course, Led Zeppelin. Tim's the only senior faculty member that thought Aerosmith or somebody like that, to give you an idea where he's coming from. So the purpose of this presentation really is to address maybe the senior faculty group more than anything else. If you have a PhD in computational linguistics, I can't answer your questions, and I know Tim can't either, so you're probably in the wrong room. So we're just going to walk you through and talk about the issues we've stumbled into as we've tried to learn about textual analysis. The first thing I've struggled with and kind of chuckled at as I've watched papers cross the desk on this topic is what exactly is it that we're talking about? It's a relatively new topic, so we don't completely have the taxonomy down as to what we're going to call this. You'll see, and it's developed, it's developed in sociology, psychology, somewhat separately from computer science, political science. Everybody's developed this on their own to some extent over the past 50 years in some cases. So you'll see it called textual analysis. A lot of what I tried to do when I first tried to learn what this is all about is I read up a lot in the area of natural language processing, which usually comes more out of engineering. Probably textual analysis, sentiment analysis, and content analysis are most closely related. You see those more coming out of the social sciences. And then natural language processing and computational linguistics you'd probably see more commonly together. I think our profession seems to be attached to textual analysis, but that's probably, and sentiment analysis seems to be popular. But I'm not exactly sure what to call what we're doing here. What we've seen, or at least I perceive, is the interest in this area has increased substantially in the past, say, 5 years. And why is that? And not just in finance, but in other areas as well. The notion of textual analysis has been around, I think, for at least hundreds of years. And I think a lot of it goes back to political science and the analysis of political speeches and looking for key words and how often they're used. So I think the notion of doing this type of content analysis has been around for a very long time. With computers coming online in the 50s, I think they saw that there might be potential for a lot of interest in this area and a lot of interesting outcomes. What happened was the initial results weren't as promising. There was, I think, a lot of grant money that went into this topic early on in the 50s and 60s, and then a lot backed out because they really weren't getting much in terms of interesting results, probably because we were trying to do something like artificial intelligence, and that's very hard to do on big mainframe computers. And so the topic really wasn't all that fashionable for quite some period of time. But certainly the past 5 years has taken off. Why? We have the computers to do it now. You need to be, you need to have lots of storage, you need to have lots of CPU. We can do a lot of it on a reasonably beefed up machine. More importantly, if you look at when they first started doing this, there just wasn't a lot of digitized text out there. So if you've got all these tools, what are you going to do with them? And now, if you think about it, not only are there corpuses, which is what you tend to call it in the business, large bodies of digitized text. We tend to lean on the SEC's Edgar's side a lot. But the whole internet is just a bunch of digitized text. Also, what makes it a little more interesting is a lot of new technologies are being developed in this area through search engines. I mean, the folks at Google and Microsoft and Yahoo spend a lot of time looking at, if you're searching for one particular topic, how do I determine if this document's relevant? Even though it may not use the specific words that you use. So they're doing stuff like latent semantic indexing and those types of things to come up with these types of solutions. So I think that's why it's become a much more popular topic in the past 5 years or so. Okay, I'll talk about data and programs next, and I would encourage you as we're going through this to please feel free to jump in and ask questions at any time. I don't have any strong agenda here. As I already indicated, Tim and I have spent a lot of time playing with Edgar because when I first started down this path, it was because I had been, you can tell by the color of my hair, I've been in this business for a while. And I'd been the standard faculty member using Fortran to pound CompuStat and Crest for a long period of time. And I just lost interest in that at some point. And I thought there's this huge amount of qualitative text out there. What can we do with that? And I started playing around with this. And Edgar just seemed like an easy target at that time. If you have some relationship with the Wall Street Journal folks, you can actually get access to their news archive, which is digitized XML encapsulated articles, all the articles that went across the newswire from, I think, 2000 forward. I have that data set. We haven't worked with it a lot. You see people now doing audio transcripts where they're not only working with the text, but if you follow this, some people are actually looking at the audio fingerprints to look at, are you under stress when you're talking, those types of things. Websites certainly have text. Some of our colleagues at Notre Dame did some work with Google searches. If you're looking at interest in particular securities. What is very fashionable now is looking at tweets and going through, of course, on stock tweets, if you're going to tweet on a stock, you have the ticker symbol preceded by a $sign. So I can go through a stream of tweets very quickly and say, here's somebody talking about Google, and try and do some sentiment analysis on what they're doing in that particular context. So those are some examples. I'm sure there are many more, but clearly there's a lot more text out there, digitized text, than there was 10 years ago. Programs. How do you approach this? And again, for the senior faculty that were in our audience, there were a bunch of Fortran programmers that do SAS and Stata, and that was about it. And much of this involves a different approach in terms of what you're doing computationally. Well, let me continue, and then I'll come back on what program we're going to use. You can get black box solutions. And if there's any single theme that Tim and I have, or any single conclusion that Tim and I have come to in all the work that we've done, is don't use off-the-shelf technology, whether it be word lists, whether it be programs, or whatever. Why? The results are many times driven by outliers. We'll discuss the specifics of that later on. And so if you don't know exactly what's going into your recipe, you'll have no idea what's going on. You need to know what's going on under the hood. So don't get a program like some of these that are available. So I've got a package program. You give me a quantity of text, a bunch of documents, I feed it into this black box, and then I'll give you measures of sentiment from how much you love your mother to anxiety. And if you just run with those results, and he's reviewing the paper, you're in a lot of trouble. Okay? You've got to know what's going on under the engine, or under the hood. If you're doing this on your own, if you're programming, you need a programming language that, and this doesn't have to be all in one package, but it's nice to be able to go out and get the data, and you're downloading many files. So if you want to download all the 10Q, 10K, and all the variants from Edgar, there's more than 600,000 files, so you don't want to have your RA just doing that over and over and over. So as Tim's RA, I want to make sure I had a program that could go through and do this automatically. So you want to have some kind of language that gives you access to the internet and the ability to just download a data set, possibly convert it into a string character variable. Although in most cases, since I know I'm going to have to go back through and reparse, I'm usually just copying files and storing them locally. You need the ability to parse. We'll talk more about the specifics of that later on. Those of you that have done this know exactly what I'm talking about. But could you do this in a traditional language that didn't have access to some kind of parsing engine? Yeah, but it would take a lot of work. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's close to impossible. It's very easy to do once you have some of the technology that's required. Most modern programming languages have access to this type of technology. I think programming is a matter of religion. And so I can't tell you this is the one you should use, because I've programmed a lot, and I know that it really is a matter of, you have to look at what your skill set is, what language have you worked a lot with, which language can you convert into easily. If you were doing this, I don't know, 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, Perl initially was one of the languages that actually was more amenable to textual analysis. So you'll see a lot of, or you'll hear a lot of folks say, oh, you're going to be working with text, you haven't done that before, you need to be using Perl. That was true many years ago. As long as you have a reasonably modern language that has access to some of the tools we talk about, it doesn't really matter. My friends in computer science will say, yeah, Perl's good, but Python's really, that's the language I should be teaching my children. It solves these problems also. So I've heard some people swear by Python. I've worked with both of these a bit. They're good languages. It's back to whatever your religion is. SAS has its own text miner. I haven't used that. I'm sure it's a very powerful tool. Anytime you're using a prepackaged tool, there's some overhead. So there are pros and cons. So I'm sure that's a wonderful tool. And I think that interacts a lot with the system they have set up at Word. So it's just something else I have used. As someone who's programmed a lot, I programmed in assembly language on a mainframe. I've programmed in C++ and you name it, I've programmed in a lot of different languages. I'm embarrassed to admit that I solved this problem using Visual Basic. I mean, that's like programming for dummies. When I taught computer programming, we would teach that as, okay, if we're teaching freshmen in computers, teach them this language because it's really easy. Why do I do that? Since I can't pound my chest and say, well, I'm doing it in F# or C++ or whatever. I can solve problems quickly in this language. I like the Visual Studio development environment, and I know you can do this in many languages in Visual Studio, but I can solve problems quickly. And so that won the day when I decided to pick a language. Again, it's a matter of religion. I'm not recommending that language, but it's a pretty simple solution. And also, I think if I were trying to convert some of my colleagues, some of the old folks in Fortran over, I think it would be easiest to convert them to this language. So one of the tools that's critically important in going through and analyzing text is having a parsing engine, which is typically done with regular expressions. So you'll hear these guys talk about regexes. And so this is a language within a language that essentially you have to learn. It allows you to look for patterns in large quantities of text. So what's driving, like when you're in Microsoft Word or something, that allows you to go through and do some things very quickly with text, it's driven by this type of engine in many cases. Let me give you a simple but complex example, and I actually just kind of put this in to come up with an example within the presentation. I haven't really gone back and thought carefully about this. And let me point out, as you're doing these things, this whole area of textual analysis is very imprecise. When I started working in this area, it took me a long time to get over the fact that there's a lot of imprecision. You're dealing with language. If we're talking about regression analysis, you invert a matrix, I invert a matrix, we'll get the same answer to within 8 decimal places if we do it right. When we're doing this stuff, you tune regular expressions. You tune a lot of your algorithms. And you try to get them up to the point where you're comfortable with them. But you never get the right answer exactly. And what's important is that you tune them to your application. That gets back to don't use the black box. So if you've never worked with regular expressions, let me give you an example. They look, this is all one line in a regular expression, and then you can go into feed a document that's essentially stored as a string to this regular expression and say, give me a vector of all the matches to what I'm looking for here. Okay, what am I looking for here? This attempts to identify sentences as I define them. And so this is a look-ahead operator within the parentheses. I know that because question mark less than or equal to tells me it's a look-ahead, which is saying, I have a target down here. This is what I'm looking for, this stuff here. And the target's going to be preceded by, one of the reasons I'll know this is what I'm interested in is because it's preceded by this stuff. Okay, so what's this stuff? Well, let's think about it. A sentence in a document. How do I know it's a sentence? Could be the very first character in the document, in which case there's nothing preceding it. And that would be a legitimate sentence. That's beginning of character. First character in a string. Or, so the bar's an or, anything that's an operator within the language has to have an escape character. So within the brackets, I'm saying any of these characters, some of them have escape characters. So what am I saying here? Any punctuation. So it's either the beginning of the string or what? There's a period a couple of spaces back, right? If I'm look ahead operator. So period, exclamation point, question mark, a space, one or more spaces, the plus, so backslash s tells me look for a space, white space, which could be, now this is a space, so one or more spaces, or I call it a sentence if I've seen, this is a line feed, this tells me 2 or more, I could have 2 to 4, but this is 2 or more line feeds. So if I've had 2 line feeds and I see a capital letter and a bunch of characters, I'm going to say, well, that's probably a sentence too. Notice this is a matter of opinion to some extent. So that's my look ahead operator. What am I looking for? I'm looking for something that starts with a capital A through Z. If you start sentences with numbers, which I don't know if that's technically incorrect or not, Tim and I have debated that. I won't call it a sentence. I'm not going to be 100% right, and I've learned to live with that. So A through Z, followed by any character except. So this is saying not these characters. It's A through Z followed by any character except a punctuation mark, a line feed, and we have, for our own purposes, defined a sentence as 20 characters or more. And again, we're within a particular context. So in our case, within the context of, say, 10Ks, if you look at shorter sentences, you're more than likely capturing headings and not sentences. So we just, somewhat arbitrarily, not completely arbitrarily, said we need 20 characters. And then this is a look behind operator. So when we see a bunch of characters, 20 characters, starts with a capital letter, preceded by this stuff, and followed by, so I had 20 characters, question mark equals, followed by a period, exclamation, so into the sentence, right? Followed by a space, or it could be the very last sentence of the document, that's the last character in the string.
I hope that has talked a lot of you out of this. Right?
So
all he's done is identify a sentence.
Yeah, that's just to identify something. So when you hear people talking about regular expression, what do I do? So as I indicated, I've got whatever document you like to give me. You give me the document. I feed it into this regex engine. So it's just, I might label this Rx and define it. And then I say Rx.matches. And it would feed me back a match collection, which is a vector of matches. Everything that matches the pattern I have asked for here. And that's the power of how you do textual analysis. That's the trick. And then you have to learn how to do these things. And it's back to, don't just pull stuff off the internet. So you can go on the internet and say, give me a regex for looking for abbreviations. And you'll find something that works maybe 60% of the time. You've got to sit down and think carefully about, how am I applying this, and where are some of these rules maybe not going to work? Being in finance, I've spent a lot of time trying to read through some literature in the area of natural language processing and related areas. after spending some time with it, I stumbled onto this, and I think it summarizes the area really quite well. Natural languages are messy and difficult to parse with computers. And it sounds like a very simplistic statement, but it was said by somebody who was really an expert in the area, and I think it really summarizes the area quite well. So I had to throw that slide up. The other thing we've learned from experience is there are a lot of tripwires. And so when you make mistakes in content analysis, you tend to make really big mistakes. I know we've made them. You know, you try to make sure. What Tim's really good at, he may not admit to being good at many things, but what he's really good at is he's very careful. So we go through I'll go through and crank out data very quickly, and then he'll go through it and say, Bill, this doesn't make sense at all. And usually he's right.
Always right, I think it is.
Usually he's right. And so here's a few things, and there's 1,000 of them. Right? This isn't more of an art than a science. You really need to be careful when you're doing this. Here's some things. If we submit a paper that looks at 10Ks, one of the first comments we'll always get is, well, why don't you break it down into components? Like we didn't know there were components to a 10K. You've got your, and it's usually management discussion and analysis, right? So why you focus on the entire document? Why don't you focus on what management's talking about? And we can look at these other papers that have done that, and we've actually done it too, because we were told to. So think about what you have to do there. And you say, well, okay, well, I can use table of contents to do that. A lot of very large firms don't have table of contents in their 10Ks, so you're missing those. I mean, many do, but many don't. If you go back prior to, well, it really kind of fades in. So the SEC side, if you're using Edgar, starts in 94 with a fair number, 95 a fair number, then everybody's required to file electronically in 96. But in terms of the HTML and the demarcation of text, that's not really consistent until some 2002 going forward, you see it get a little bit better. So if you want to use any of the old data, you can't rely on the HTML or something else to kind of tell you this is what's going on. Or you eliminate a lot of your sample, or you bias it toward very large firms and you don't know that. Because the larger firms tend to be the ones using more of the well-demarcated segments. So this is tricky. The other thing in doing it, just little things. So what are you looking for? You're looking for Section 7, management discussion and analysis. Did you account for the fact that many times management's misspelled, which we found? Did you account for the fact that many times they listed as Section 6, which they're not supposed to, they just screwed up? And even if you get that right, and this is back to making errors. So you found Section 7, hallelujah. You've got to find Section 8 exactly right. And if you don't, you're going to call everything past Section 8 part of the MD&A. And it's going to be an outlier in your sample. And so it's back to when you screw up in this, you screw up and it will affect your results. And that's why I'm really reluctant to try and get into breaking these things. I've worked a lot with parsing out segments of 10Ks. I can get it about 90-some-odd% accurate, but it's back to those last 5% scare me to death.
Well, every one of them has a separate line that you have to write. I got you, right?
Everyone has a separate line.
So when you get down to the final 5%, they have some quirky error.
Yeah, at some point, yeah, you almost have to write a line of code for every exception.
Yeah.
It's hard to write an algorithm that captures a lot of things. Yeah, you're right. If you've looked at any of the word lists we have one that Tim calls these weasel words, and I'll be interested to see if he can get that in a publication someplace. We call them modal weak words, which is a little nicer sounding. So if you say, I might, I could possibly do something, those are weasel words. And so they're interesting things to look at in financial documents. And actually we found that they do tend to relate to things. Well, one of the weasel words is may. Well, the first time we did this, Tim, again, in his thoroughness, discovered there's a tremendous seasonality in this word. Interestingly, firms filing in the 5th month of the year use it more than others. We weren't able to publish that result, but so what do you learn? You learn, oh, geez, so when I'm using my Reg X, Before I do that, I go through and take out every capitalized may. Now this gets back to type 1, type 2 errors. So wait a second, but you could start a sentence with may. I'm betting you won't in a financial document. Because for me to start trying to figure out, is this the beginning of a sentence or is this abbreviation, I'm more than likely to make a mistake. So I'm more than likely to call the month a word when it isn't. Okay, so I just go through and take out all the capitalized mays, and then I go through and look for may. Again, a tripwire, a result that can drive your results. If you're looking for modal words, you're going to have this, a lot of firms in a particular period of time focused on this word, which will drive your results.
It's also some firms that fiscal year ends in May, and those guys spiked up, right? No, right? So.
Not so much a tripwire, or I don't know. Again, just my learning curve in this. So one of the things, once you get into, if you have to do sentences, which is much harder than just parsing for words. If you have to do sentences, sentences are all based on punctuation, right? So one of the first things you've got to do is get all the abbreviations out of there. And so I thought, well, I know that's not like one line of code, but hey, 5, 10 lines of code, I'll have this knocked out. And then you go to the computational linguistics literature and you start reading, publications in their best journals that are very long, debating how you come up with the optimal algorithm to do this. And you realize, hey, this really isn't very easy. So a lot of things that you start out you may think are simple, and if you come up with simple solutions, it's back to you're probably making major mistakes. I've already indicated this, a tripwire. If you're doing this on files, especially pre-2002, they tend to not be very structured. And there you have an obvious division of the ones where you're going to screw up, because if you're assuming some kind of structure, tend to be smaller companies. So you're going to have a small firm bias if you're assuming structure in the document. So those are some tripwires. Tim suggested I go through a sample application. And again, we're leaning a little bit on SEC, Edgar applications. It's by no means limited to that. We have looked at other things. We are doing other things. Many people are doing other things. It's just this is where we started. This is where we're probably most comfortable. And there's certainly a ton of information out there. So how might I go about attempting some kind of, I just label it 10x, because the first thing you have to do is say, okay, I want 10Ks. Well, there are 10K 405s, there are 10Ks. They're all basically the same thing, so you have to be sure to identify all those. 10K SB for small business. Do you want to include 10Qs, in which case you also have to have the 10Q, SB, so on and so forth. So let's just call that a 10X. What would I do first? First, I go on the back door of the SEC site, and I've downloaded probably terabytes of data from the SEC, and I guess it's your tax dollars at work. They haven't called me. I've actually interacted with the technologists there. I keep waiting for them to contact me and say, we're going to block your IP, stop doing this. They've got great servers. They'll feed this information up, and it's available to everyone. So the first thing I do is I go through and I've got to figure out where these documents are. And the way you do that is you go into the master index at the SEC, which is at this website. If you'd like to email me, I can email you these slides. I'd be more than glad to email these slides.
I can put it on your website.
I can put the slides on my website too, which we'll reference at the end. But I'm McDonald.1 at nd.edu. You can look me up on the internet, so pretty easy to find. Or call Tim at home anytime. So for every year and every quarter, and I start in 1994, year, quarter number, so quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3. Computationally, obviously, I'm just going through some loops, right? And so for every year and every quarter, I'm going to go in and pull down a file called master.idx, I believe, off the top of my head. And this is what that file, it's a text file, and so this is just what that file looks like. So I skip through the header and just start reading this line by line. Okay, so each line contains the CIK, which is the identifier that Edgar uses, which unfortunately is not directly tied to the perm no or anything else, so you have to sort that out. This is pipe delimited, so it's using pipes to separate the text. Name of company, this is the form type, the date of the filing, and this is the file that I need to look for. Okay, so suppose I'm looking for, I don't have any 10Ks here, do I? Suppose I'm pulling 10Q. So I'm pulling 10x. So I'm going to say, in this file, what is this, 2011, so this probably has 200,000 lines. Probably in the fourth quarter of 2011, that's not a big period, probably about 200,000 filings. So I've got to go through 200,000 lines, and I'm going to identify all the ones that have the form type that I'm interested in. And then I'm going to, as soon as I see that form type, I'm going to pull the file name that I'm interested in. Okay? Identify target forms. And then I'm going to just immediately feed that into this URL out to here, and then I'm going to plug in this target file name. Okay, so I'm just looping through, pulling down these files. I'll store them locally. That way I don't have to do this again. Okay, so once I have all these stored locally, I've downloaded 600,000 10x files. I'm going to pull each one up, obviously, in a loop, and I'm going to go through them and do my stuff. In this case, let's assume we're just parsing for words. So we're going to do word counts, maybe some type of sentiment analysis. There's all kinds of things you can do. I know that. But let's just assume we're parsing for words. All your filings, you can go to the SEC site and you can pull up an HTML version of the filing, which is very nice and has all the pictures and everything. But everybody's required to file the entire filing as a pure ASCII text file. And that's what I'm pulling down. So I want to go through these text files because I know what's in those. If you have a pure text file, if I included it, and not that many firms, well, it's not extremely common, but it certainly shows up. If I included a logo, a picture, in my HTML version of this filing, if you know anything about converting pictures into ASCII encoded text, so my little picture might take, if the document's this big, this much of it may be text, and ASCII encoded stuff may account for this much of the total document. And this much is what you're interested in, and this is just pictures, graphics, PDFs that have been shoved in there. Could you look at those? Yeah, you could. It's not something that we've taken specific interest in. More recently, you also have XBRL, which takes huge amounts of space, which is focused on the tabular information. We take the tabular information from CompuStat, so we're not going in and trying to parse that out ourselves. XBRL makes it's extensible business language, so XBRL tells you this number. So if I give you a number, 1 billion, it has the XBRL tags saying in dollars, this is total assets, so on and so forth. It's amazing the level of detail they give you for each data item. We're not interested in that. So I'm pulling out all the XBRL. We remove, again, we're not interested in going through the financials. You could do this, we're just not doing that. We remove tables. Now this again sounds like it's pretty simple, because even the less sophisticated firms will demarcate tables with hashtags, the table tag. And so this is the regex for everything between this and this. The problem is, this gets back to tripwires, a lot of less sophisticated firms use tables to define paragraphs. So their document, everything that's a paragraph is just preceded and followed by a table indicator. So if you just go through and knock out tables, you're knocking out all the text. Can't do that. So you want to go in there and look at it. You bring in all the information between table and table. You look at the number of alphabetic characters, and you look at the number of numeric characters and decide at what percent. I think we're using around 20% now. I think we started at a lower number. At what percent are you going to call that a table? You'll get it right hopefully most of the time, but you're not going to get it right 100% of the time. You don't always have to do this. It kind of depends on what the focus of your study is. Sometimes we do this where we think it's important in terms there are a lot of repetitive words, profit and loss or something that I really don't want to see, then I take it out. If we're looking at something else, we may not take it out. So this is not, you need to take this out. At this point, I've played around with everything where I still need the HTML markup in there to identify a table or whatever. So now I just want to take out all the HTML. If you didn't, font would probably be the most frequent word occurring in all documents. So you want to take out all your HTML. This really isn't important for what we're analyzing, but I usually go through and re-encode because it's an ASCII file. For example, the ampersand sign is always indicated by and amp. Spaces and in the SP, right? Semicolon. So you go through and just take out all that noise, basically. Not critical, but I usually do that. So we're shooting for words in this example, right? So what I first want to do is look for. I'm going to go through the document. I'm going to create a vector of things that look like words, because I don't know if they're words at that point. And what are things that look like words? Well, I use a regular expression. I have an indicator here that says ignore case. So you'll notice I'm just saying uppercase, but I'm telling it case doesn't matter. A word boundary. So within regular expressions, they have, because a word boundary may be a space, it may be a line feed, so it can be a lot of things. A word boundary followed by a hyphen or A through Z. And I want to see 2 or more of these. So Tim and I arbitrarily decide we're not going to count A and I as words. If you do in 10K documents, you're more than likely going to stumble over headings and count those as words, and they're just not important words. So our words have to be 2 or more characters, followed by a word boundary. So I feed the document through this regex, and boom, I've got a vector of tokens, things that look like words. Okay? Then you need to take those and work through a dictionary. Another feature of the language you're working with, you need something like hash tables or dictionaries so that as I pull in a token, I don't have to go through 80,000 words and say, does this one match? I can just look it up, right? So you need some kind of hash table capability in your language that you're doing it. So take the word, iterate through, or take the token, iterate through each token, see if it's a word. If it's a word, count. How many times did this word occur? So we've got a master dictionary. We just go through that master dictionary list. We tabulate the words, and we've got a count of the words. And then if you're focusing on sentiment, the words that are a subset of those that are in a particular sentiment list, we'll talk about in a second, you have to count for those. You have the total number of words, so you have the proportion of positive words, negative words, those kinds of things. Question?
What would you be pulling in that wasn't a word?
Pardon me?
What would you be pulling in that wasn't a word there? You have to look up the dictionary to make sure it is a word, but...
First of all, in our dictionary, we don't include proper nouns and geographical locations, those types of things. We don't include abbreviations. And sometimes there's just some garbage in terms of characters that may be defining a table in the old days or something. So you run into just some garbage in the document. Okay? So this just, you've got to count it anyway. You just got to see, is this a word?
Your dictionary is what, like 85,000?
It's around 80-some thousand, 85,000.
Yeah.
So, and that's,
Well, I look through it sometimes, I'm like, this is not a word, and I'll look it up. Oh, it is. It's a legal word.
But for example, we don't do a lot of chemical terms because that's going to become essentially a dummy variable indicating this is it's an industry dummy variable. So we don't do a lot of chemical. We don't do a lot of special. Well, I have dictionaries later, but you can go on the internet and you can find dictionaries that range from about 30 in English dictionaries. That range from about 30, and I've discussed this with some of my colleagues in terms of doing this in other languages. And we debate as to whether it's more or less challenging. So you can find dictionaries with, and technically, if you're in this profession, you go, those really are dictionaries. They're just word lists. Technically, you're right. You'll find word lists from like 30,000 to over 1 million. And so you've got to decide, am I playing Scrabble here, or am I, what am I interested in? And we, for whatever reason, decided, we don't want proper nouns. We're not going to mess with that. We started with a reasonable list of generic words, common words, and then I went through all the 10Ks and looked at tokens that weren't in the dictionary and looked for ones that occurred most frequently to add words that didn't happen to be in this dictionary that we pulled up. There are lots of great word lists. Anybody know why there are lots of great word lists out on the internet? Because if you're trying to hack passwords or whatever, you need word lists, you need dictionaries, you need lookups. So so I can go through and just go through this dictionary and try and break into your account. Word lists play a very important role. So there's a lot of stuff out there, not because finance researchers are interested in it. I don't know how important this is, but it's an issue, and you see some people go one direction. We chose to go another. I'm not saying we chose the right path, but I have an opinion on it. So when creating word lists, so if we're going to create a word list of words we think are important, or if we're counting words, should we list all the root words, lexemes, and stem? So the stemming means, well, I'll do it in the next slide. Or expand all root words to include inflection. We expand all the root words and count inflections. So what's stemming? And there are plenty of good stemming algorithms out there. So you can pull code down that does a pretty good job of this already. You don't have to write your own. If I'm counting words like expense, I'm just going to lump them all. So if I say expensing, if I say expensed, if I say expensive, those all count as this. And I might even take this E off and just call this my lexeme. So everything that looks like this is going to be counted as this particular token. And that's one approach. That's stemming, where you're taking all your words and trying to get them down to a common, where there's a common lexeme. We go ahead and inflect everything and expand the dictionary to include all of the possible inflections. Why? Because it's back to, I've got to know what's going on under the hood. I've got to know exactly what's going on in terms of choices. Maybe all these aren't good examples, but certainly in our profession we'd understand you would always take odds and parse it down to odd and count it as odd. Odd and odds, at least in our business, aren't the same thing. So this doesn't always work. And if you look at the literature on this, textual processing literature shows that stemming does not in general improve performance. Why? Because it doesn't work well for morphologically rich languages. The English language is not very good in terms of when we go to past tense and all the variants of words. We're just not very consistent. Some languages are. Supposedly German's much easier to do because it's much more structured. So if you have a very well-structured language, stemming may be a great idea. We don't think so. That's subject to debate. Okay, so next I'd like to talk a little bit about word lists, because we've put together some word lists. And
Why did you put together the word list, Bill?
you told me to.
No, but why?
Because historically people have looked at sentiment and those types of things. And
If there's other word lists, why do I need to use yours?
Well, we'll get to that, right? It's back to don't use black boxes. We'll see that in a second. Tim should have presented this. It's like driving with my wife.
This is on tape, Bill. Kathy will see it later.
Sorry, Kathy. So what did we do to create our word list? First, we created our master dictionary. I already talked about that. So we actually started with a word list, and we added to it words that are out of the 10K. So we wanted to make sure we had business words. Like in our original word list, I don't think accretive, was in that word list, but it's certainly one that shows up a lot in 10X type documents. So we added that to it. So we created a dictionary. Then, how do you do it? It's just hard work. You go through that list, and it's subjective. We were caught in a situation where we thought some of the other word lists that were being used weren't very good, and I kept struggling with Tim on this of how do we go out and objectively find some word list that works better? And there's nothing out there. I mean, it has to be developed in the context of what you're doing. So finally I said, let's see if we can get away with it. We're just going to have to create our own. It's subjective. We went through the word list for all words that are used more than 5% of the time, not including inflections of words that are common words. We also include their inflections. Why wouldn't we go farther down that list? Well, it takes a lot more time. And also, if you get to the point where you're identifying, again, rarely used words, they become indicator variables for specific companies. So if the word elephant is only used by this one company, and you count that as an important word or something, there are ways of creating problems in all this. So we try to avoid some of those by avoiding rare words and just classifying those that we see. And what's our very objective standard? If I'm reading a financial document, so if I'm looking for negative words, if I'm reading a financial document and I see this word, am I more than likely to be concerned? That's about as fuzzy as it gets, I know, if you come from a quantitative background. But that's the standard we used. And we put a lot of time into building the list, and then when we were going through the paper that we published in Journal of Finance, Cam Harvey, who obviously has his own finance dictionary, so I think he had some interest in all this, spent a lot of time going back and forth with us, along with an associate reviewer, of let's think about these words, let's think about these words. So there's been a number of eyeballs putting together the list that we created. So what are the, I don't know that this is an exhaustive list, but most of the lists that we came up with, negative words. So what are examples of negative words? Loss, bankruptcy, indebtedness, felony. This, you know, if I see felony in a filing, I'm going to read that sentence again. So you know, that concerns me. How many of those are there? We unfortunately, so we did all this initially for the Journal of Finance paper. I forget what year we actually did the dictionary for that. I think it was 2007, maybe. The language and the usage of language in these types of filings, unfortunately for us, changes. So I've tried to update in 2011 and make things a little more current. Positive words, far fewer. Beneficial, excellent, innovative. There are far fewer that are unilaterally positive. And another important issue, note that in financial reporting, unlikely, you don't have problems with people using negative words in positive context. You don't see people reporting, these are not terrible earnings, right? But a lot of people will you'll see them do this in publications, and it makes a lot of sense, prima facie. You know, at first glance, you go, why don't we look at the net kind of positive minus negative over positive plus negative or something like that, right? But if you actually, and Tim is the one that does most of this, if you actually go through and read this stuff, read 10K filings and read some of these situations, what you'll find is that many, many times if I have to say something negative, now think about it. So if I'm writing a letter to Tim to fire him, and I've drafted that letter many times, if I'm writing a letter to Tim to fire him, I've probably got 3 paragraphs of saying, Tim, you've been a great colleague, you show up for work, you eat with silverware. You know, I just go on and say all these superlatives, all these positives. And then somewhere at the end it would say, unfortunately, we're going to have to dismiss you. And so you go through and net all this out, hundreds of positives, 3 negatives, so this was a really positive document. What you'll find are writers tend to frame negative statements with positive words. And so we don't put much stock in positive word lists, but you see people doing it. We're reluctant. We'll do it sometimes because
Hey Bill, I have a question. Why don't we have to go 2,349 negative word lists? Why don't we just pick the top 10?
Okay, so another thing, and some people have done this thinking, well, why did they use this approach? Why don't you just run like this essentially massive regression, looking for large responses on filing dates against counts in your dictionary, and just identify the words that really have a lot of kick to them, right? So maybe there's 2,000 some listed here. Maybe there's 25 words that really have all the kick. Why aren't we just using those? Huge endogeneity problem. So we discover if you use the word aardvark, you're going to lose money next quarter. Well, what do people writing these documents do? They stop using that word. You got a better reason?
No, I think it's an important reason though, right? Because go try to write around 2,349 negative words. Good luck, right? Because we're going to catch it, right?
Yeah. So that is a good. Occasionally, Tim makes a good point. We've tried to make an exhaustive list. And again, at first glance, you can say, no, why don't you just list the really important words? No, we've tried to make an exhaustive list. So if you're trying to write around this, it's harder. It's not like there are these target words that you can avoid. So beyond positive and negative, which is fairly obvious, uncertainty words, which is not necessarily just risk. So we do have things like risk, but it's not, risk, standard deviation, variance, or something like that. But also ambiguity, approximate. So more uncertainty words versus purely risk words, although risk words are included in it. 291 of those. Occasionally of interest, do you have a lot of legal sounding words, litigious words? And that number we started out with when we first did this, 50. And then as you go through and all these tokens, we're not sure if they're words, you're going, this can't be a word. The lawyers are using a lot of words that if you spend a little time, you figure out these are actually words. Already referenced these. These are actually pretty simplistic and pretty short list, but in the stuff that we've done, they're pretty useful words. when you tend to use things like always best, definitely, highest, lowest, we will do something, that's a pretty strong signal. When you're saying could, depending, may, not capitalized, possibly, sometimes, weasel words, that's usually signaling something.
When I present, I usually point out that the strong modal are the language of parents. You will do your homework. You must be on time, right? I have 2 teenagers. Weak modal is the language of weasels. Teenagers, right? No, seriously. And actually, it does make, weak modal is often really strong, where in the 10K, they're putting in all these weasel words. That should tell you something, right?
This is from a very old paper, but it's back to, I think it's a very good summary. It gets back to don't use off-the-shelf technology. Don't use black boxes. Content analysis stands or falls by its categories. Particular studies have been productive to the extent that the categories were clearly formulated and well adapted to the problem. So you really need to develop word lists in the context of what you're doing. We hope that the list we've put together work well in the context of financial documents. But for example, suppose you say, okay, I buy that, so I'm going to do the, you say this Twitter stuff, that's fashionable, I'm going to do tweets. Well, sucks isn't in our financial dictionary.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, and and all the irony that's usually in tweets is, so you really have to spend a lot of, because I've worked with this, you have to spend a lot of time trying to sort out when is negative negative and when is negative positive, and what's the language here that we're dealing with. But it reemphasizes you need to develop a dictionary in that context. You pull ours off the shelf and use it, you're going to screw up. Okay. Why is it so important to keep track of what's going on under the hood? There's something in natural language processing called Zipf's law. It is not a law, but if you're familiar with power distributions and how many, it's interesting how many things turn out to look like power distributions. And the example I would use is the distribution of words is like the distribution of market cap in finance. Sometimes it's hard to convey to students. There's just a few really big firms driving, there are a lot of small firms and there's a few big firms driving everything. It's even more so true when you look at words. Even if you exclude, some people will say, well, why don't you take out stop words? We don't do that. I've got a list of stop words out there if you want to use them. I don't think it's important. But clearly, I think accounts for 8% of the words out of 10 billion words on all these filings from 1994 to 2011. Out of 10 billion words, the is 8% of them. The next one's around 5%, which is of, I believe. The next one's around 4%, which is and it just drops like a rock. But if you take any reasonable subset of words, you're going to see the same pattern. And what that tells us, and this we'll throw out the table from our paper because that's the essence of our paper. And again, if Tim's reviewing your paper, if you say we get this particular result with this word list, he's going to say, show me the top 25 words. What's driving your result? Because those top 10, 25 words will account for a huge percentage of the total count for a particular sentiment. Okay, so it's back to...
And sometimes they're goofy words.
Yeah.
Like goofy.
So that's the punchline from our Journal of Finance paper. I mean, I've learned from working with Tim that if I can produce a table of numbers where he laughs hilariously, we're doing well. Because I showed him this list, and it wasn't exactly in this form initially. In terms of the people that are doing this stuff in finance are using the Harvard Social Psychological Dictionary, which is a sentiment dictionary that was developed in the 60s at Harvard in sociology and psychology. And folks that are doing financial textual analysis are using this word list. Let me lift up the hood and show you what's producing the result when you say these are negative words. And this is where he laughed for quite some time. So when you're reading a 10K document, if you see the word tax, do you get upset? Is this unusual? Does that scare you? No. The ones that are checked here are ones that we also would include as negative. Losses, impairment, yeah, that concerns me. Against, adverse, we take those out. But, cost, a lot of firms have cost. I don't know that that concerns me. Again, because we're taking a word list from another discipline, I'm not sure why, but in the Harvard list, board is a negative word. I don't think that spills over. It took Tim about 30 seconds to figure this one out because he's going.
It took me longer than that. I'd say.
I don't want to reveal too much.
I said, Bill, you did a code in here again.
Yeah, because he's thinking, why is somebody using the word vice in their 10K documents? And vice is a negative word. I said, Tim, vice president. And he goes, oh, geez. And not surprisingly, it shows up a lot in these documents. You're counting those as negative. So if you're running this off-the-shelf word list and generating results, and you never really look at what's driving those results, well, look at what is driving those results.
Look at foreign.
Yeah, foreign is a negative word.
Right? Foreign exchange, right? Oh, that's negative. Oh, come on.
Yeah, so
I like depreciation. That's one of my favorite ones, too.
Thus the title of our paper. When is a liability? Not a liability. That was because liability is one of the negative words. And notice in terms of cumulative percent. So if I go down this many words, I don't know what that is, maybe 25? Out of the list of, how many do we have negative words?
Oh, this is
2,000.
This is Harvard, though. So it's
Oh,
over
this is Harvard was
4,000.
4,000 with inflection. So the Harvard negative word list is like 4,000 some words. Out of 4,000 words, in terms of tabulating them, 50% of your count is attributable to just these words. So that's, again, if you're doing this, look at what drives your results.
Why don't you spend a minute talking about the word mine?
Interestingly, yeah, so some of the words we didn't list up here, and there's another one that somebody pointed out to you that I didn't get. You can catch that. No, catch that, yeah. So there are clear words that are industry flags. Mine is a negative word in the Harvard Dictionary, because if your children grab a toy and say, mine, that's not a good thing. Interestingly, there are certain industries where that word's used a lot. So once again, you're going to count their documents as being extraordinarily negative. And if you don't check what you're looking at, then it's a problem. What was that? Gold?
Gold is a positive word.
Oh, so yeah, gold's a positive word. There's certain industries.
Crude is also a negative word, which is a negative word.
makes
It's
sense.
crude.
Yeah.
Does anybody know why crude would appear in a 10K? Crude oil. There you go. And then there's, once again, some industries, it's huge number.
Okay, I think we're about out of material here. So what resources are available? I don't know, but I'll share about anything I've got with you. I have all the files downloaded and actually pre-parsed. So if you're interested in all the 10Ks and 10Xs, that's, geez, I don't know, it's maybe 50 or 100 gig. I actually sent it to someone in Europe on 5 thumb drives because we couldn't come up with it. We've got access to box and everything else, so we can probably get it out there. Where I've pre-parsed all these files to strip out all the stuff where you can just focus on the text stuff. But at this website, I've got a bunch of material out there that you may or may not find useful. All the cinema dictionaries are listed there. Again, we've updated them to 2011, but we can also give you the ones that we use for the Journal of Finance paper. What we find very useful in everything we do is having a master dictionary. So what do we count as words and what don't we count as words? And actually, I have this set up as a spreadsheet, so it's an Excel file. So for every word, it actually tells you the frequency that that word occurred in all 10Ks. I think I just did 10K for this count. So you can look at proportionally in financial filings how frequently these words being used. And then it tells you which of the sentiment classifications. So there's essentially a 0-1 variable. Actually, it has the year that we added it to the list. Telling you this word is a negative word. So there's a spreadsheet that has a lot of stuff for a master dictionary. You might find that useful if you do any of this. I think I mentioned before, some people, because if you're doing this in political science and some other areas, it's useful to take out stop words. I don't find that particularly useful. I know that the, of, and, that are going to show up a lot, and I can account for it. So I don't bother to take those out. If you would like to take those out, I have some fairly good lists there. The problem with that is it's a matter of opinion as to what a stop word is. So I just assume not get into that. But that's a matter of taste. I've also posted a spreadsheet that has every 10Q, 10K, 10KSB, 10K405, whatever else. Each line represents every filing, and it has counts for all the different sentiment lists that we have. It has the total number of characters and the gross number of characters. So before I strip out all the stuff, the gross number of characters, the net number of characters, the number of XBRL characters, the number of ASCII encoded characters. So if you're in accounting and it was interesting to say, do better structured documents create bigger earnings surprise or something? You could take this spreadsheet and do that study in about 30 minutes, I think. Not that that's a particularly interesting one, but I don't know what accounts find interesting. So this file, yeah, sorry, I get in trouble in my classes for making fun of accountants. I've had that comment many times. My daughter is an accountant, so it's okay. This file is about 100 meg, I think, but you can download it fairly quickly. I have other resources that take up a little more space, but as I indicated, I'd be glad to share whatever I have. Tim, you have anything to add? And we're certainly open for questions.
I like typos, so once in a while I'll look through our list and I'll freak out. I'll say depreciation is used 13 times in our entire document. And I'm like, we have a major error. It's a misspelled word of depreciation, right? And then we also we got this one in print where Arthur Anderson, the accounting
I forgot about that.
Yeah, that's kind of a funny one.
One of our best results.
They misspelled their name 69. It's worse than that. It's 69 times on the letter of who audited the firm. Their signature line.
The
Arthur Anderson, and we don't even know how to spell our own name.
Tell me how you discovered that?
Yeah, so what Bill did it, and he told me, we had a paper and we wanted to control for auditors. Does that make sense? So Bill went through and looked at the names. And then he gave me the documents as usual. And I said, oh, got an error right here. There's no way that Arthur Anderson did so few audits. And he's like, I did it right. I go, no, you didn't. I did it right. And then I pulled him up and I go, oh, that's it. He misspelled Anderson with an O, not an E. Right?
Yeah.
I know. So there's a lot of errors out there, But some of them, I get them, but that is kind of funny, isn't that? You have a quick question?
Well, how about like in some documents, depending on whether it's published in England or in America, the words like defense,
maximize. Yeah. I think we counted that in our dictionary. I've addressed that. I don't remember which side of the fence we came down on, but I think we allow variance. Good point. Yes.
Okay, so say you parse a document, you do everything, you find something interesting, and you go to write the paper, and you've done the tweaking that's necessary. Do you describe all the tweaking in an appendix?
As you probably well know now, web appendix is where you put everything. So yeah, we usually try to go through it and in a web appendix, write down a recipe for what we've done. Now, even at that, it's hard to replicate because what was your regular expression specifically that you used to do this? Or exactly how did you do it? It's going to have a big impact on the outcome. So this is a big fuzzy part of our profession right now. Yeah, good point.
A lot of times what we do is we follow Loughran down 2011.
Which is just laziness.
Yeah, but that's...
Do you come across a lot of new words?
Yeah, so, and I wish I can't remember off the top of my head what those are. But as I indicated, we did this in 2007. So what did I do? I went through all the more recent filings and looked for things that look like words that aren't in our dictionary. And I forget how many I added, but there's 30, 40. The language changes.
Is Dodd-Frank a new word, maybe?
We haven't included that yet. The only proper noun we include is shoals. Because if you don't, people are interested in looking at option stuff, and black's in there. Black is a word, but shoals is not, and it occurs a lot in these documents. So we, by fiat, decided that is a word, and not a proper noun.
And are changing usages problematic? The difference between
We're not.
word and language?
we're not parsing at that level. It's back to, you'll notice the example I went through. The example I went through is where I would be most confident, if I read a paper, if they're doing this, I'd be most comfortable with the results. If you start telling me that you're diagramming sentences, you're telling me that you're building artificial intelligence. And we're really not very good at that. I mean, you look at the people that do it for a living, and they're not very good at it, and they spend a lot of time at it. So the deeper you try to parse, the more I'm sitting there thinking your results are driven by a mistake. Okay? But the simpler, and that's, I think the trick to coming up with great applications of this particular technology is to come up with simple tricks. Tim and I did a paper on business ethics. We just looked for ethics, ethical, ethically, corporate responsibility. You know, there's like 6 words we looked for. That I'm very confident in the results. But if I start telling you that I'm capturing the nuance of words, don't believe me.
The other paper we did is we did code of ethics. Everybody familiar with code of ethics? Do you think people copy the code of ethics? Yes, plagiarize the heck out of it. They just copy somebody else's. And the trick is you don't know who you're copying. So Bill wrote this kind of a cute program that basically took a snapshot, a photograph of each sentence, and they compared it. And then we compared like billions and billions of sentences. And then we're like, they copied the whole thing, except they changed the name of the firm.
Which a lawyer would say that's good practice, right? Because this is a document that's survived in courts. So you copy, you know, everybody in HR copies Marriott's HR stuff. That's what HR people tell me.
And then also we
That's
found
what
out that the NYSE said, we're going to help you out. Put things like this in the code of ethics. Yeah, you saw how many times they could appear all the time. And it's a really weird sentence. It's very poorly written. But it's used everybody. Everyone's like, what are we going to write? We'll just use what they told us to write. Word for word.
But if you use the legal excuse for copying, you really choke on it when you read some of the sentences, because some of the sentences are like, you know, ethics is at the core of what we do in our beliefs and values of this. You know,
that was one of those common
they're waving the
sentences,
flag and singing the song, and you read the sentence, you go, wait a second, this showed up in 10 other documents.
It's more than 10.
No,
that was a common one.
Yeah.
There's over 100.
So if there's not any academic material in all this, there's certainly some humor in it if you're bored and have time to go through it. Other questions?
Well, come on up if you have any questions. We're all done a little early. The students always like that.
Thank you for showing up. We appreciate the opportunity to talk to the group and appreciate Jay and the FMA asking us to do this. Thank you.